I never told my husband that I secretly owned nearly half of his father's company, a stake worth over $20 billion. For 25 years, Alexander knew me only as Elena Harper, the quiet, dedicated nonprofit consultant who drove a 10-year-old SUV, wore sensible coats that lasted seasons, and lived with him in a modest 2-story townhouse in Arlington, Massachusetts. Our life together was deliberately simple, and he embraced it fully. Mornings began with coffee brewed in an old French press, sipped on the small back porch while we watched cardinals at the bird feeder we'd hung together. Evenings often found us in the kitchen, chopping vegetables side by side, trading stories from our days while something simmered on the stove and soft jazz played from an ancient radio. Weekends were for long hikes along the Middlesex Fells trails or browsing flea markets for pieces of furniture we could refinish in the garage, sanding and staining late into the night, laughing over mistakes and celebrating small victories. He loved me for my steady presence, my fierce belief in second chances for people society had written off, the way I could make him laugh with a single raised eyebrow. He never once imagined that the woman who curled up beside him every night, her head on his shoulder as we read separate books under the glow of one bedside lamp, held the controlling interest in the global shipping empire his family had spent generations building and guarding. The secret began 30 years earlier, when I was 20 years old and still finding my footing after college. My grandmother, Beatrice Harper Sharp, no-nonsense woman, who had quietly amassed wealth through careful post-war investments in infrastructure and shipping, passed away and left me $800,000. Along with the money came a single handwritten note tucked into the envelope. Use this wisely. Elena, build something that lasts, not something that merely impresses. While friends my age spent similar inheritances on gap year travel or down payments on trendy condos, I spent months in the university library and later in coffee shops with stacks of annual reports. One company stood out, Langford Global Transport. At the time it was staggering under the weight of overextension and a brutal market downturn. Reginald Langford, Alexander's father, had borrowed heavily to grow the fleet and acquire new routes. But when freight rates collapsed, lenders pulled back, banks refused new credit, investors fled. The balance sheet looked ugly, but the underlying assets were strong: strategic port access, long-term contracts with major retailers, a fleet that could be modernized. The company needed only patient, unintrusive capital and time to recover. I decided to become that capital through a series of layered trusts, holding companies, and offshore entities designed to obscure ownership. I began buying shares on dips. My attorney, Patricia Lang, handled the mechanics with absolute discretion. It took disciplined living, frugally, reinvesting every dividend, but within 5 years I owned 18%. By the time I met Alexander at a charity gala in Boston where he was there representing Langford Global as a sponsor, and I was speaking on sustainable supply chain initiatives, I held 35%. We stood near the bar, champagne untouched, talking for hours about ethical business practices, about whether profit and purpose could coexist. His eyes lit up when he spoke of designing buildings that served communities rather than egos. When he asked for my number, I gave it without hesitation, heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with his last name. 2 years later, we married in a small garden ceremony with 50 guests, a string quartet playing our favorite songs. By then, I controlled 44% of the company. Over the following decades, through careful purchases during recessions and reinvestment of dividends, my stake grew to 48%. Current valuation, just over $20 billion. Reginald Langford had unknowingly worked for me for most of his professional life. I kept the truth hidden for several reasons. Most importantly, I wanted Alexander to love me without complication or doubt. I needed to know his affection was for the woman who argued with him over crossword clues and cried during sad movies, not for potential access to wealth or status. Second, I wanted to observe his family. Could they accept me? Could they accept us if they believed I brought nothing material to the marriage? For 23 years I endured their subtle and not-so-subtle dismissals. At holiday dinners, Reginald would ask about my little charity projects with a tone that implied they were charming hobbies. Victoria would sigh wistfully about old friends of Alexander's who had married into suitable families and now summered in Nantucket. And slowly, painfully, I watched their worldview take root in our son Julian. The boy who once begged his father to read him one more chapter grew into a young man who winced at our old car and asked why we didn't have a bigger house like Grandma and Grandpa. For the last 2 years, I had allowed the tension to build deliberately, no longer deflecting every slight, quietly preparing documents and proxies with Patricia. I knew the confrontation would come, and in the first week of December, it did. Alexander came home on a Wednesday evening, snowflakes catching in his dark hair as he stepped through the door. He dropped his keys on the hall table with more force than usual. "My parents invited us to dinner Friday," he said, loosening his tie. "They texted, important family matter." Formal wording. He looked at me with the familiar mix of resignation and protectiveness he'd worn for years whenever his family was involved. "We can say no." I was at the stove stirring soup, the scent of thyme and carrot filling our small kitchen. I set the spoon down, wiped my hands, and crossed to him. "We'll go," I said quietly, touching his arm. "I want to hear what they have to say this time." He searched my face for a long moment, then nodded. Together, then, the next 2 days passed in ordinary rhythm, my work at the nonprofit coordinating housing programs, Alexander's late nights refining blueprints for an affordable eco-community, our evening walk around the neighborhood holding gloved hands. But beneath the routine, I felt the calm certainty of someone who has waited decades for a single moment. Friday evening arrived with a biting wind and the first real snow of the season. We drove the familiar route from Arlington to Dover in our aging SUV. Alexander's hand resting on my knee as it always did when he sensed tension ahead. Streetlights blurred past, then gave way to the darker, tree-lined roads of old money enclaves. The Langford estate appeared at the end of its long, curving driveway, white columns glowing under landscape lights, symmetrical wings flanking the main house, grounds immaculate even under a dusting of snow. Every window shone warmly, but the welcome felt icy long before we reached the door. Margaret, the housekeeper, opened it promptly, taking our coats with professional neutrality. The fact that Victoria did not greet us herself was the first signal this was no ordinary family dinner. In the foyer, Reginald waited, still tall and imposing at 74, silver hair perfectly combed. His handshake lingered a fraction too long. Testing, Victoria emerged moments later in navy silk and her signature pearls, offering an air kiss that hovered inches from my cheek. Julian's voice drifted from the living room. "They're here, lazy and bored." When we entered, our 22-year-old son glanced up from his phone only briefly. "Hi, Mom." "Hey, Dad." The second greeting carried the weight of reluctant obligation. We were ushered to the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set for 5, Reginald at the head, Victoria and Julian aligned to his right, Alexander and I opposite them, deliberately isolated. Crystal sparkled under the chandelier, china and silver gleamed. The first courses arrived with mechanical precision. Then, a light soup while conversation stayed safely superficial. The incoming snowstorm, traffic from Arlington, Alexander's current project dismissed by Reginald as interesting in a small-scale way. Victoria inquired about my nonprofit with the polite sympathy people reserve for causes they consider noble, but impractical. Then the tone shifted like a tide. Turning, Reginald launched into a detailed account of the new Pacific Hub, expansion, $3 billion committed, a 15-year strategic vision. I listened silently, tasting nothing. Every dollar of that financing had passed through entities I controlled. I had personally approved the final tranche 20 months earlier after weeks of due diligence. Yet he spoke as though the triumph belonged entirely to his foresight. Victoria smiled thinly. "I ran into Marcus Whitmore at the Symphony last week. He's doing wonderfully. New waterfront home. Absolutely stunning." Alexander's fork paused. Marcus, an old college friend of his, the family had once hoped he'd marry into a better match. "We're happy," Alexander said firmly. "Of course," Victoria replied smoothly. "Choices shape lives in such fascinating ways, don't they?" Julian finally set his phone aside. "Grandfather's given me real responsibility now," he announced, addressing the table more than us. "I'm leading the integration team for the automated terminals, actual strategy." "That's wonderful," Alexander said, genuine pride in his voice. Julian met my eyes briefly. "Some people build things," he said coolly. "Others just advise." The words landed like small stones. I felt Alexander tensed beside me. Deserted delicate chocolate mousse arrived largely untouched. Then Reginald reached beneath his chair and produced a slim leather portfolio. With the confidence of a man who had closed countless deals, he slid it across the table to Alexander. Inside lay a separation agreement and a check for $500,000. Reginald leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Let's be direct. You married above your station. We've tried to accept it for Alexander's sake, but we cannot stand by while Elena lives in unnecessary constraint out of misplaced loyalty. This settlement is generous more than fair. Sign, take the money, and allow her to return to the life she was born for. Victoria added softly, almost kindly, it truly solves everything. Julia nodded. Dad, you're holding her back. Everyone knows it. Alexander's face strained of color. He looked at me, eyes pleading for guidance. I gave the smallest nod. He set the check down carefully. Before I respond, he said, voice remarkably steady, I need to make one phone call. Reginald frowned. This is a family matter. Son, lawyers aren't required. Alexander met his gaze. Everything about this requires clarity. He dialed Patricia from memory, placed the phone on speaker, and set it in the center of the table. Patricia, I said calmly, we're having dinner with the Langford family. Please confirm the current ownership structure of Langford Global Transport. Patricia's voice was crisp and professional. Langford Global has 200 million shares outstanding. The controlling shareholder is Harper Trust Group, holding 96 million shares, 48% currently valued at approximately $21 billion. Harper Trust Group is wholly directed by Elena Harper, sole beneficiary since inception 30 years ago. Reginald Langford personally holds 19%. The room went perfectly still. Victoria's wine glass slipped from her fingers, red blooming across white linen. Julian's phone clattered to the parquet floor. Reginald stared at the phone as though it had betrayed him personally. That's impossible, he whispered. I rose slowly and walked around the table until I stood before him. 30 years ago, I began, my voice quiet but carrying in the silence. Your company was on the brink of bankruptcy. No lender would extend credit. I was 20 years old. I studied your operations for months, balance sheets, route maps, contracts, fleet specifications. The assets were undervalued, the core business resilient. You needed only patient capital without demands for control. So I provided, autonomously, through structures you never traced. Every major expansion you attribute to your vision, the Pacific routes, the automation investments. The recoveries in 2008 and 2020 was funded by my holdings. You have worked for me for most of your career, Reginald. You simply never knew. I turned to Julian, whose young face had gone pale, eyes wide with shock. Julian, I needed to know whether my son valued his father's character above the appearance of success. Tonight I have my answer. Your executive mentorship at Langford Global ends immediately. Perhaps now you will learn what building something truly requires. Finally, I looked at the torn check scattered across the table. I never wanted your money. I wanted familia, real one, not measured by addresses or bank balances. I wanted to love your son without the weight of inheritance or expectation. But you weighed his worth and found it insufficient. I held out my hand to Alexander. He stood and took it instantly, his grip warm and certain. We have a long drive home, I said softly. We left them sitting amid the ruins of their certainty. The drive back to Arlington felt both eternal and too brief. Snow fell steadily, muffling the world outside our windows. For the first 10 miles we were silent, headlights carving tunnels through white. Then, Alexander pulled over on a quiet stretch of road, hazards blinking softly. How long? He asked, voiced rough with emotion. The investment began 5 years before we met, I answered. I never intended permanent secrecy, only long enough to be certain your love was for me, not for what I might offer, and long enough to test them. You let them hurt us for years. I nodded, tears rising. I believed patience would teach them humility. I thought Julian would see your heart clearly. I was wrong to wait so long, to let pride and testing cause you pain. I'm sorry. He reached for me across the console, and we held each other while snow collected on the windshield. When the tears slowed, he whispered, and us, does this change us? I touched his face, tracing the lines I knew by heart. Only if you let it. I choose you, Alexander, the man who shares burnt toast and bad puns, who dances with me in sock feet to songs on an old radio, who has never once made me feel my worth was tied to money. That man is my home, billionaire or not. He kissed me then, fierce, grateful, grounding, and we drove the rest of the way, wrapped in quiet. Understanding that Monday morning the emergency board meeting lasted 12 minutes. I took the seat Reginald had occupied for 40 years. Outside directors, professionals bound by fiduciary duty rather than sentiment, voted unanimously to transition to professional management and remove Reginald as CEO. He sat at the far end of the table, diminished, said nothing in his defense, and left without protest when it concluded. I felt no triumph, only a deep ache for decades lost to misunderstanding. The weeks that followed were raw. Julian left voicemails I could not yet bring myself to play. Victoria called 17 times in 3 days. On the 4th day I answered. "Alina," she said, voice stripped of its usual polish, trembling with something that sounded like genuine fear. "Please, we were monstrous. Let us try somehow to make this right." "I need time," I replied gently, and ended the call. 2 days later, a courier delivered a handwritten letter on heavy cream stationery, 2 pages from Victoria, ink smudged in places by fallen tears. "We thought we were protecting Alexander from hardship. We were arrogant, blind fools. You saved everything we claimed to value most, and we treated you as lesser. Your husband is the finest man we ever dismissed, and you are the strongest woman we ever underestimated. When you are ready, may we come to you? No conditions, no performance, no envelopes. Just parents who finally see." Alexander read it beside me, on our worn living room couch, his arm around my shoulders. "Do you believe her?" "I believe loss has made her honest," I said. "One chance here, in our home, as we are." I texted, "Dinner at our place next Friday, 7 o'clock, casual, just family." Her reply came within seconds. "Thank you, we'll be there." The following Friday, they arrived precisely on time. Reginald wore jeans and a simple navy sweater, no tie, no blazer, no armor of authority. Victoria carried a modest bottle of wine from a local shop, hands trembling slightly as she offered it. They looked smaller, almost fragile. Standing on our narrow front porch, we ate at our small kitchen table, my grandmother's marinara recipe, garlic bread baked in our temperamental oven, salad from greens we'd grown in pots on the porch the previous summer. Conversation began haltingly whether the drive, but gradually Reginald set down his fork. "Alina," he began, voice rough, "I owe you apologies that span 25 years. Every holiday where I diminished your work, every assumption about your ambitions, every time I implied Alexander had settled. That check was the worst of my arrogance, assigning a dollar value to a man whose wife held our entire legacy in her hands." He turned to Alexander, eyes glistening. "Son, I taught you the wrong measures of success. Your wife has shown me how hollow they are." Victoria reached across the table for my hand, tears falling freely. "I raised Alexander to seek security above all. When he chose you, I feared hardship, but you gave him joy I never understood. We poisoned Julian's mind with our prejudices, that failure is ours alone." Alexander spoke quietly. "Julian will need to apologize himself when he's ready." They nodded. It was not instant forgiveness or full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, honest, awkward, real. 3 months later, the world had shifted in ways I could not have scripted. Langford Global's stock climbed 40% under new professional leadership. CEO I selected for proven competence in sustainable logistics, not family ties. Reginald now consulted only 2 days a week, listening more than directing, offering institutional knowledge without demanding control. He sold the Bentley, bought a Toyota Camry, and seemed lighter, as though a weight he had carried for decades had finally lifted. I formally launched the Harper Family Foundation with an initial $100 million endowment drawn from my holdings. I stepped into the director role full-time, expanding programs for scholarships, transitional housing, and job training, especially for those the system had already dismissed. Victoria began volunteering 15 hours a week, using old society connections to open new doors for funding and partnerships. She discovered a purpose that could not be measured in guest lists or gala seating charts. Julian resigned his cushioned role at Langford Global and accepted an entry-level operations position at an unrelated mid-size logistics firm in the Seaport District. He moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, learned to budget a real salary, rode the T to work, and paid his own bills for the first time. One Thursday evening he met Alexander for coffee at a quiet cafe near Harvard Square. They talked for 3 hours about expectations, disappointment, the slow erosion of values. Julian cried, Alexander later told me, admitting how deeply his grandparents' views had shaped him. He is not yet ready to sit across from me, but Alexander says the work has begun, and I believe him. Every other Friday, Reginald and Victoria now join us for dinner in Arlington. Sometimes they cook. Victoria has mastered a decent vegetable lasagna and laughs when the cheese bubbles over. We speak of books we're reading, foundation projects, the garden we're planning for spring, not stock prices or net worth. They leave with genuine embraces and promises to return soon. On quiet evenings, Alexander and I stand together on our narrow back porch, watching the seasons change, now melting into crocuses, then fireflies, then brilliant autumn leaves drifting past the porch light. The neighborhood hums with ordinary life, children biking home from school, dogs barking, neighbors calling greetings over fences. "Do you regret the years of silence?" he asks sometimes, his arm around my waist. "Every single day," I answer honestly. "I regret the pain it caused you, the time we lost to proving points that should never have needed proving. But I have never, not for one moment, regretted us." I am Alina Harper. I am a nonprofit director who fights daily for the overlooked and underestimated. I am a one-secret billionaire who learned that power exercised quietly can protect as much as it can reveal. I am a wife who discovered that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage, for it strips away pretense and forces hearts into the open. And I am a mother still waiting, patiently now, for her son to fully return to the values his father has embodied every ordinary, beautiful day of our 25 years together. Love without condition outlasts any fortune. Character lived consistently and quietly eventually speaks louder than wealth ever can. And redemption, slow, humbling, imperfect, is possible when pride finally bows to truth. The greatest strength often grows unseen in modest soil, blooming only when the moment demands it. Our story is not ultimately about money uncovered or secrets kept. It is about a marriage that endured tests no one else knew we faced, a family painfully remade through confrontation and grace, and the quiet realization that true wealth is found in the people who choose to see you really, see you on, love you still.